יהושע. בתור הדוברת הראשונה רציתי להזמין את פרופסור סוזנה אשל, הבת של אברהם יהושע אשל. היא תדבר באנגלית, אבל התורה היא מעבר למילים, אז אפשר להקשיב למנגינה גם, ולחום ולאהבה. פרופסור סוזנה אשל, חוץ מלהיות הבת של אברהם יהושע אשל, היא היסטוריונית מאוד חשובה, חוקרת של חוכמת ישראל, וגם כתבה ספר חשוב על ההתנהגות של הכנסייה בגרמניה הנאצית. עכשיו היא עובדת על היחס של חוכמת ישראל לאסלאם, והיא מהראשונים שבישרו את הפמיניזם הדתי בארצות הברית. בבקשה.
That I have to speak to you in English. I hope you don't mind. I want to thank Dror Bondi for bringing us all together this evening, but so much more for all of the hard work that he's done in translating and gathering my father's writings. And yes, I agree, my father's work is very needed at this time. So you're doing something wonderful, really wonderful for the Jewish people, and I thank you for that. And I also have to say, I'll just tell you something. There are many people who've written about my father's work and who also call themselves disciples of my father, people who were students of my father's, some people who never met him. But sometimes when I get to know them, I feel there's something missing. They miss the human qualities that my father embodied. They miss sometimes his teachings because their behavior is not what I would associate with my father. And so it was some years ago, when I first came to know Dror through email and telephone, and just last year we met in person, that I came to realize that finally there's somebody who is a disciple of my father's, who is a real mensch and who knows what my father was about. And I thank you so much, because for me that's a very important gift, to have your friendship and to know that you're here, and that it's someone like you who's bringing my father's work in Israel. I also want to say how happy I am that my cousin is here, Naftali Flittenstein, the son of the Kapitulitz Rebbe. I knew your grandparents, and I knew your great-grandparents because they were my aunt and uncle, my father's sister and cousin. The Kapitulitz Rebbe was in New York City. So it's so nice that you're here too, and to be here with friends and friends of friends and people that I hope will become my friends. I'd just say a few words about my father, and then I hope that you'll also ask me some questions. I want to say, first, what do I want to bring to you? I want to first emphasize my father as a human being, and also my father within the family. I think sometimes people don't always realize my father, yes, came from a Hasidic family. He actually began to grow up even before the First World War, not just in between, because, but that family in Warsaw was a remarkable family. My grandmother's twin brother was a Novominsker Rebbe. Do you know what's Agudas Yisrael? Do you know who's the head today of Agudat Yisrael? The Novominsker Rebbe, the grandson of the Novominsker in Warsaw, who was the twin sister of my grandmother. My father grew up in a family where he said, and I have to emphasize this, he said he grew up surrounded by people of religious nobility. And I think that's a very important statement. It's a statement that you can't really explain. The words itself stand for it. There are people who write about my father and tell you all kinds of details about his life, but I think that's the most important. He carried his family in his heart. His family, his friends, the world in which he grew up. Carried it in his heart because it no longer existed when he became an adult. But he returned always to that family in his heart for strength and for courage and sustenance. And he always went back to his family to his brother-in-law, the Kapitchnitzer, whom he spoke to on the telephone a couple of times every week, but also went to him to talk about what he was doing and how he should do it and whether to do it. So many different times when there were questions, should my father, he wondered, my father, should he go to Rome to meet with the Pope? There were Jews who attacked him for it and said, let the Pope come to him. My father went to the Kapitchnitzer, who advised him, yes, you should. If you will save one Jewish life in the future, if it will help, of course you go. But it was more, it was also the family that gave love, and still does, my family, my Hasidic family. And I think it was important for my father to know that he was a very emotional person, someone who understood emotions. People could go to him, I could go to him too, with all kinds of feelings, and he always understood those feelings. And I think it was important for him also to be a person rich in emotion in order to be a religious person, and to cultivate emotion, and to appreciate it and accept emotion and understand it in other people. Some of this comes from the tradition of our family. You know that we're descended from some great Hasidic Rebbes. The Abderov was especially important to my father. And he had the Sefer, the Oiv Yisrael, where he put in, for example, when I was born, and which he always had in his room in a special place. Actually, and when I got married, I thought, why carry a bunch of flowers, you know? It didn't seem... So I carried that Sefer. I thought that was the right thing to do. And it meant a lot to me. But the Abderov, who my father talked about all the time, was an extraordinary person in many ways. He was someone who didn't publish in his life. His teachings were gathered later, after he passed away, in a volume called the Arv Yisrael. The Abderov was known for his kindness and his generosity, and I think of my father in that way also. And I'll just tell you one or two things of his teachings that my father used to tell me, because I think it's also about my father. So there's one that maybe you know, you read it in some of his books, my father's books. Many people would go to the Abderov and they would pour out their troubles. Every day. Dozens of people, hundreds of people. And somebody once asked him, his shamus asked him, how do you remember all these people and their problems? And he said, when somebody comes to me and pours out their troubles, I open my heart, and their troubles come in and they make a scar in my heart. And when I go to daven, I open my heart and I say, look, God, at all these scars. And I think my father was also such a person, if you talked to him and you knew that he was listening in that way. I think that's a very precious gift. It's a precious gift to be that kind of person. It's a precious gift to be able to talk to someone like that, who listens in that way, and who really has cultivated that kind of a heart. There's another teaching that was in a different place of the Abderov, where he says, you know, we, human beings, we speak about God in anthropomorphic terms. That is, in human terms. We speak about the arm of God, the finger of God, and so on. We image God in human language like the human body. Okay, we know this. But then he says, how does it look from the other side? And you know, I think it's an extraordinary thought. So what does it mean? When God looks at us, how are we imaged? You can't even speak the words, because already to begin to talk about it is to lose it, is to immediately anthropomorphize. And in some way, that's also what my father means when he wrote a book with the title, God in Search of Man. So what it is to be needed, to be seen, to be imaged, to know that there's another way that we are seen, that we become in a different perspective. My father's gentleness and kindness was something that I found and still think about. It's so precious. He was a very tender person, very loving, and very sensitive, and very kind, and very generous. But I mean that in many ways. So when it happened, unfortunately, that a couple of us colleagues passed away, men, and they left behind a widow and children, and my father would gather the other professors to have a meeting, not only the professors, but also other people who were friends, who were people of means, to talk about what to do to help this widow, financially, concretely, practically. You know? So I mention this only because he really did something. He wasn't just talking. Yeah? he did something very concrete to help people. Because, he used to speak sometimes in irony. In that interview he says, my father had known people who were also opposed to the war in Vietnam. My father was sleepless over that war and the terrible things that were done to civilians in Vietnam. And there were people who were arrested, friends of his, the Berrigan brothers, priests. They were put on trial for civil disobedience against the war in Vietnam, and the jurors said, these people should be convicted, these priests. They have no business mixing up with politics. And my father said those jurors would even send the prophets and even God to jail. Because if you look at the Bible, God is always mixed up in politics. And so, of course, my father took things very personally. He was sleepless over Vietnam. Just sleepless. It tore him apart. That period when there was a terrible rush of bombing in Vietnam is exactly when he died. But my father, I want to tell you, was also somebody who knew how to celebrate. My parents weren't interested in entertainment. They were interested in celebration. And that was something that I suddenly realized was missing when he passed away. He knew when somebody came over how to make a celebration, how to make the person happy, someone who was just getting engaged to be married, or it was a birthday, whatever it was, there was a celebration, and he knew how to focus attention and to make everybody happy. And he really made an effort to do that, and he did it so wonderfully. He also was full of humor. He loved to joke, to laugh, and he had a big laugh. When he laughed, he really laughed a lot with his whole body. You could see his body moving as he laughed, and he loved Jewish jokes. And he loved to tell the jokes. He also loved it when he had already heard the joke, and he would tell the person. So there was a lot of laughter and a lot of humor and a lot of joy that he exuded with every bit of his being. He would come home at the end of the day, and somehow everything was happy and lively all around him. We came to Israel together as a family several times, and he came also by himself many times. My father felt very strongly that he did have a message to bring to Israel, and at the time people weren't so interested in listening. I'll tell you, I appreciate so much today that people appreciate my father's work. It wasn't always like that. And I actually remember about 10 years after he died, suddenly becoming aware that people were beginning to respect him and appreciate him, because it wasn't in his day. And there were times when he was, in fact, very upset and worried about it. And other times when he felt, well, they don't understand, but it's still important. He felt he had something important to convey, and he wanted to reach as many people as possible, and he hoped that someday, and I know that if he were here with you today, he would be so happy to see you and to see that you were so interested in his work and to talk to him, and he to talk to you. It would have meant so much to him. It really would. And if he had only known Dror, that would have been so wonderful for my father, such a gift. Okay, let me say finally one last word. Dror is working on Torah Min Hashamayim. Those were the happiest days of my father's life when he wrote that book. It's a sefer, really. When he wrote that, he came home at the end of the day feeling so happy every day and saying it. I'm so happy. He wrote the book so quickly, people couldn't believe how quickly he wrote it. But it was all inside of him. He didn't do research to find the text. He knew the text, and it just poured out. And he wrote this. And it gave him so much joy to write that book, more than with any other book he wrote. I also want to just say that my father came to the United States in March of 1940, struggling very hard to save his mother, and there were 3 other sisters that he also tried to save and couldn't. He was desperate in Cincinnati to get people to do something with him. He went to demonstrations in Washington and New York. After the war, he met my mother, and they got married. They moved to New York. They had a child. And it was at that point that my father started writing again. He had written a few articles, but not much. And then the books just poured out of him, one after the other, books in English. And that was wonderful. My father loved music, and my mother was a pianist. And when they met, which was at somebody's home, that evening after dinner, there was another professor of music who was there and asked my mother to play. And my father fell in love with her. And music was always an important part of our home. We had chamber music, piano trios and quartets once a week. And my mother would sit down at the piano after dinner, and my father would say, "Play some Bach." And my mother would play, and it was soothing, and it was beautiful. It was wonderful. So I just want to say finally, the last thing that I know was so important to him was to study all the time, to read everything and read great books. And he did. If he was deficient, I would say he never read much of American literature. You know that big book about the whale? No. But he knew he knew German literature, all the great classics. When I was studying Renaissance history in 10th grade, he knew everything. He knew all of the history. He knew also studied art history in Berlin. He had a remarkable mind, and he was never without a book. Whether it was a book of philosophy or a Hasidic sefer, it was always a book in his hand, and he always studied constantly. And I really do think that his work has incredible depth because he was such a learned person. A learned person. It was both his extraordinary spirit, his neshama, but it was also his hard work and the training of his mind that gave him enormous depth into what he read, what he studied, what he interpreted, and also to understand what it is to be a person. He understood the complexities of life and how difficult life can be and how to respond to those complexities, not in a shallow way, but in a profound way. So I miss him very much, and I appreciate with you the wonderful legacy left behind of his work. And I'd like to ask if you would like to ask me any questions that I might be able to respond to. Yes?
You spoke about his...
You're from Skidmore.
You spoke about the Vietnam and his how much he cared about what was going on around him. What do you think would keep him up at night right now?
What would he be right at this time? I think he would be terribly concerned about corruption, about dishonesty, mendacity, something he spoke about in his lifetime. Look at what corruption has produced in this world in terms of the economic disasters that are not just about governments, but individual human lives and families. The corruption, the lying, the stealing of investment banks, for example. Yeah? And you have it here, just as we have it in the States and other parts of the world, people not wanting to pay their taxes. What kind of a thing is that? It's a gift to be able to do that. Yeah? And the corruption, excuse me, you have two presidents who stepped down. It's time for soul searching. How could this happen? What does that mean? Yeah? So that's what would keep him sleepless, I'm sure, and many other things as well. Yes?
I guess your father was, from what I know, which is not a lot, but it was a man of complexity, man of diversity, which is a thing that is very common, in places like Israel and others, which speak about pluralism, about accepting different ideas, accepting different kinds of interpreting reality. So I'm very interested in what he was talking about in terms of the connection with Western philosophy and Hasidic, Judaism, and so on. Because it's not something which is that easy. And so the connection is. Did he ever spoke about it? Except for his books and so on. Like,
yes.
Private life and so on.
Yeah. So the question it's a wonderful question about my father's Hasidic background coming together with Western philosophy. And did he talk about this? And he, of course, was immersed in both worlds. When he went to Berlin, he discovered that the professors, the great learned professors at the university, really didn't understand religion, even though that was their field. Yeah? And he felt there is something they needed to learn from him as much as he from them. He wrote a book called Passion for Truth, in which he talked about what he discovered, which was this My father said, when you come to talk, for example, to Christians, don't talk about what divides us. Nothing a Jew says about Jesus is ever going to make a Christian. Don't talk about it. We have nothing to discuss there. Instead, let's talk about other things. What do we do when we feel despair? What do we do when it's time to daven and we don't want to? What do we do? How do we overcome that? What can we share with one another on that level, what he called depth theology? Yeah? And so there he found that, for example, the Kotzker spoke about authenticity and truth in a radical way, and he found also there are Western philosophers who speak in the same way. And for that he chose the philosopher from Denmark called Søren Kierkegaard. There were certain philosophers, of course, that he wouldn't have talked about in that context, such as Heidegger, right? But yes, in that sense he saw, not that he was comparing the two as being in any way equal, but showing that, yeah, we are all dealing with these problems. Yes?
In the last Shabbat, I had the privilege of talking with Joe about the father. And one thing that came up was that your father had a real clocket inside of him. That came out in different ways. The clocket between the Baal Shem Tov, the ruling to the thoughts about the clocket, how to look about the Torah, so something that was learned to men, or something that came from God. And I would like to ask you how you felt it about the father. You saw him as a man,
as a man who would have this inner machloket, is that what you mean? I would put it this way. I think my father wasn't so much that he had these inner conflicts, which is a wonderful comment, by the way, that you make. I would say that he recognized that things are not simple, that things are complicated, and that there are no simple answers to complex problems. My father always, in one sense, first of all, let me just say, his life was saved by the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, which was a reform rabbinical school. And he always respected what they did for him, even though he wasn't comfortable with the place. He was very unhappy. He taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary that's conservative, yeah? But he never called himself a conservative Jew. He preferred to daven either, it was a Kapitchnitzer, but that was far away, or in our neighborhood, the Gerish Steeple with Rabbi Tziviak. I think my father raised me with the sense, not so much of the conflict, of course there are conflicts, or the sense of never be satisfied, because there's always something to think about, to worry about, to be critical of, to be self-critical. And that's, in part, Kotsk. Yeah? And also to feel comfortable everywhere, even if you're uncomfortable. That is, to feel comfortable in different kinds of Jewish settings. And I appreciate that. To be able to daven in a Hasidic shtiebel and also feel comfortable where I can be called to the Torah for an aliyah. And to go to the workman's circle with these Yiddishes and talk to them too. But to be comfortable everywhere. And perhaps also to be uncomfortable. He always was critical where he went and told people not what they wanted to hear, but what he felt they ought to want to hear and what they needed to change and improve. That was part of him as well. So yeah, the conflict, but I think in a very constructive and positive way. Yes?
Is there any, or you're feeling that he's mostly adopted in the United States by the non-Orthodox community and just starting to be adopted in Israel? What's your feeling towards it, or was he frustrated by it? Did it matter to him?
Yeah, was he frustrated by the way he was received or not received in certain communities? Yeah, I think at times he really was. I don't think he was accepted in the Orthodox community in America at all. I'm not sure he was ever invited to lecture at an Orthodox synagogue, for example. I think he was sometimes very much welcomed by Catholics, by Protestants, for instance, yeah, and less so by Jews. But maybe because he was also very critical of when he went to speak to Reform rabbis, told them what was wrong. I think the times that he was invited to give lectures in Israel, he was warmly received, even though he was also criticized by some people in different ways. Not always understood. That's true. Yeah. Yes?
Two questions. First, something I just realized now. How does it happen that someone who obviously writes so well writes in such a late stage of his life? I mean, if I read correctly, and I just quickly check, I mean, his first books, The Sabbath and Man's All Alone, are a masterpiece. I mean, and so how come he wrote? How come he came only when he was 50? I mean, why did he write till then? Was he did he want to mature in his ideas? I find it very strange. That's the first question.
Okay. Actually, he was 40. Yeah. So it's a little bit, yeah. But I think what happened, why did he start writing these books at this late? Not many people can write a book like that when they're 20. Okay. But no, look at what happened. So he was born in 1907 in Warsaw. He went to Berlin in 1927. He finished his dissertation and submitted it in December of 1932. He took his exams in February of 1933, where the professor says he was gehemmt and nervös. He was nervous and inhibited. Of course, a Jew in Berlin in February 33, you know. And then it took almost 3 years before the book was published, because you can't get the PhD unless it's published. Why wasn't it published for so long? Because in Nazi Germany, for a Jew to get a book published was not so easy. Yeah? And finally got it published thanks to Moses Schor in Poland by the Academy of Sciences in Poland. And then he had to get it accepted by the University of Berlin, which kept writing to him letters signing Heil Hitler. Can you imagine? And finally, almost 3 years later, he got the PhD. And then he was desperate to get out and get a visa somewhere, and like everybody else. And yes, he did write. He had tea with a publisher, Eric Rice, who said it was the anniversary of the birth of the Rambam in 1935. And my father went home and in 3 weeks wrote a biography of the Rambam, in 3 weeks. And he also wrote other things, learned articles, but he didn't, who expected this? He thought when he came to Germany, maybe he would get his PhD and become a professor at a university. The intellectual life, the cultural life, Berlin in 1927 was a great center of the universe, yeah, culturally, intellectually. So then came the war. How could he? Yeah, and then he got married, and that makes a difference, doesn't it? Yeah, and then it poured out of him. Some people thought his English was so good, and he came to America not knowing English. They thought my mother wrote them.
Second question: what was his relationship to Martin Buber? I mean, his personal relationship and what he thought about that person's ideas.
His relationship to Buber, Martin Buber. Well, he met Martin Buber in March of 1936. He was invited to Heppenheim, where Buber lived, and they had tea, and there were several people. Feuchtwanger was present at that tea, the first one, the publisher, Ludwig. And they had a lively conversation. My father described it in a letter to a friend, and there was a debate at the table. What's more important? Buber said, learning Gebet, learning the prayers, learning the words of the Siddur. And my father said, not Gebet, sondern beten, praying. Learning how to pray, that's more important than the prayers. And Buber didn't agree. At any rate, Buber was much older, an older generation. My father was very respectful of him and always was respectful of other people. And even if he disagreed, he never wrote in his books, I don't agree with so-and-so. He didn't do that. He set his own position and didn't engage in polemics. And he always felt Buber was someone deserving of great respect and had done a great deal for Jewish life in many ways, even if he disagreed with him, even if he felt that Buber didn't know as much about Hasidic texts and ideas as the stories weren't enough. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, they remained friends, and they remained in correspondence. Buber was kind of a Germanic professor type and was a little bit authoritarian and would tell my father to do this, proofread my manuscript. You don't do that anymore these days, but in those days. And my father, we were in Israel actually when Buber passed away, and my father was able to go to the funeral. So yes, they had a respectful relationship.
שאלה אחרונה.
Well, kind of obvious. I guess you grew up in the years with your father where Israel was getting important in a way. 67 war. You were, I don't know, you were a child or I don't know exactly.
Yeah.
What did you get at home concerning Israel, Zionism, in fact, from your father?
Well, I can tell you I actually do remember, because everybody remembers the weeks before 67 were terrible, terrible, terrible fear.
Yeah, the anguish.
Yeah, everybody was, and everybody was in a panic, and my father was as well. So, and then he came to Israel a few weeks later and wrote a book called Israel and Eklov Eternity, Israel Netzach, in Hebrew translation. And he felt it was a miracle. What happened was extraordinary. My father always emphasized that it's important to understand the religious dimension. That is, for him to be a religious person means also to be involved in social and political issues, social welfare of a community of the country, and political issues. How can I pray, he said, when this war is being conducted in my name and they're dropping napalm on children in Vietnam? So, and with the March in Selma, the civil rights movement, there were so many Jews who were involved, young people, but no one in the Jewish world said, yes, this is a great religious moment. This is an enactment of Jewish values. This is the Bible. They didn't talk that way, and he felt that was terrible. And so also with Israel, yes, it was military and political and so forth, but he felt that there was a profound religious dimension to what happened and to what Israel means, and that's what he tried to convey in that book. He also said things that, Israel is no compensation for what happened in the war. He made that very clear. Israel is the state of Israel is not a compensation for what happened to us. Yeah. Because people were talking like that in those days a lot, yeah? And that was one thing. And then he also said, we do not worship the soil. The state of Israel isn't about the soil. It's about something much more and much more profound. Yeah. So those were the kinds of things we were talking about in my childhood, about Israel. We wanted very much to come here. I wanted, every time we came, I said, why are we leaving? And my father couldn't get a job. And that was too bad.
He wanted?
He wanted, yeah. If he had, he would have. So I'm sorry about that. Thank you all very much.